Orchids have some of the most beautiful flowers in the world. When growing them, the most common reason that they die is because of overwatering. In this video, I'm going to show you how to water your orchids properly so that you can keep your orchid alive for years to come. First and foremost, you need to know when to water your orchid. Orchids like to stay on the dry side of things, so whenever you're watering your orchid, you need to make sure that the soil is dry. And there are several other indications to know when to water your orchid. One indication is the color of the roots. If the color of the roots are white and a bit wrinkly, like in this photo, then they need water. If the roots are plump, white, and green, they're probably fine. However, if the wrinkling persists and the roots are mushy, your orchid is most likely suffering from root rot caused by overwatering. A second indication is to look at your orchid's pseudobulbs. While not all orchids have pseudobulbs, some podial orchids, which mean many stems, include Cattleya, Dendrobium, Epidendrum, Oncidium, and Laelia orchids do, along with many others. While monopodial orchids, such as Phalaenopsis, grow from a single stem, they typically do not have pseudobulbs. When you look at my Cattleya here, you can see the pseudobulbs.
I know, it doesn't have roots. I'm gonna make a video after I'm done with this one on how to make your orchids sprout roots again after losing them. So check that one out once I'm done making that one. Oh, and also, they can last for some time without roots thanks to the pseudobulb's ability to store up water, but they are in critical condition.
They're in between the leaves and the rhizome. The pseudobulbs, when they're wrinkly, indicate that they need water. The older ones, I will say, that the older they get, the more wrinkly they will become, so you'll probably want to check the younger ones first. Now that you know when to water, I'll tell you how to water an orchid. But first, let me tell you what not to do when watering your orchid and other information that'll help you understand and how to water your orchid.
Most orchids are epiphytes, meaning they don't need soil and they grow on trees. Since they do that, they're used to soaking up moisture as it falls from the rain in the rainforests. This is the reason they're so easy to overwater, yet if you leave them dry for some time, they'll start getting wrinkly, since they're not used to soaking up hours and hours of wet soil in standing water and not going dry for long before some more rain dampens their roots again. Some common watering mistakes for orchids include putting ice cubes on the orchid to water them. Orchids grow in tropical climates which basically never get to freezing temperatures. They're not used to these conditions, which gives them basically zero frost tolerance at all, so their roots will get damaged over time. Another common mistake is misting your orchids to water them. While misting can help ensure proper humidity levels, misting them is just not a sufficient watering method for them. Even if you mist heavily, only the upper roots will get the majority of the water. There are some more rules to follow when watering your orchid to keep them alive and healthy. You'll need to water your orchid more often whenever it's blooming, since it will need the energy to produce the flowers. But do not water the flower stalk or the flowers whatsoever, as that could lead to rot of the flowers. Another rule is the higher the temperature, the more often you're going to have to water your orchid. And one big rule is to water under the leaves, because watering the leaves can cause standing water on the leaves, leading to rot, which could kill your orchid altogether, especially monopodial orchids. Now, this rule I found really fascinating. There is actually a preferred time to water your orchid, and that time is in the morning. This allows any excess water to evaporate throughout the day instead of it sitting in water overnight, which may lead to root rot. Got any more tips? Please leave them in the comments.
Now that you've learned these tips and tricks, I'm finally going to show you how to water an orchid correctly. The way you water an orchid actually depends on the growing medium it's in. I put timestamps in the description so that you can get to the spot for the right watering information for the growing medium your orchid's in. If your orchid is growing in bark,
put your orchid in its pot in a cup or a container without holes. Skip this step if your orchid's pot doesn't have drainage holes. Next, water your orchid until the water level reaches slightly above the growing medium, allowing your orchid's roots to soak up all the moisture it possibly can for 10 minutes. After that, place your hand on the orchid's top bark and gently flip over the container, draining the excess water from the pot. Then, get the orchid in its pot out of that container. Orchid wood chips will actually repel water, but when you soak it, it'll keep the water longer. You'll probably need to water your orchid's bark every 4 or more days depending on your bark, orchid species, temperature, and humidity. And of course, water once it becomes dry.
If your orchid is growing in sphagnum moss, you'll first need to prepare your sphagnum moss so you can water it correctly. You shouldn't be doing this every time because this is more of a one and done thing. To prepare your moss, you'll want it to be light and airy. Sphagnum moss can get quite compact, leaving little to no air for your orchid's root system. That ends up suffocating them and killing your plant altogether. You'll want the moss stretched out and all over the place in this pot. You may already have your moss like this, so you may not want to get your orchid out after all. I'm using cucumber vines as a replacement for sphagnum moss since I do not own any. However, please do not use cucumber vines as a growing medium for orchids. Next, you're going to want to poke sphagnum moss through the drainage holes of your pot. Then you'll want to put it into a second pot with no drainage holes, or a tray or a saucer will do as well. The sphagnum moss will act as a wick for the excess water underneath your pot. This in turn will make the moisture last longer.
Put your orchid back into the pot. Don't let the moss cover the pseudobulbs at all. Then, put a lightweight material such as bark, wood chips, or small rocks that are not heavy at all over the moss. We just need a tiny layer of it to keep the sphagnum moss from getting outside the pot, just not enough to compact it.
Now that you've prepared your moss, here's how to water it. What you want to do is gently water the moss around your orchid for 1 to 2 seconds. That's it. Sphagnum moss has excellent moisture retention, keeping water for your orchid for several days. Now that your prepared sphagnum moss is airy, your orchid's roots won't drown. However, there is one drawback. Since sphagnum moss is an organic matter, it decays. Since your sphagnum moss is wet, bacteria flourishes, making it rot faster. However, there is a way to combat this. You should let your sphagnum moss dry 1 to 2 days before you water again. Most orchids like a dry period anyway, but some do not, such as oncidium orchids. For a rule of thumb, don't soak your orchids if they're growing in sphagnum moss, as it can compact and suffocate your orchid roots. If your orchid is growing in a pure perlite medium, repot your orchid. Pure perlite mediums have been criticized by growers by being too wet, and when they're dry, they're too dry. Growers have even found root rot on their orchids that were grown in a pure perlite mix, and since perlite is so small, it can get all over the house. I recommend growing mediums such as bark, wood chips, tree fern fiber, and sphagnum moss. You can find the time steps for those in the description for the watering information. If your orchid is growing in tree fern fiber,
put your orchid and its pot into a bigger second pot that has no drainage holes. You can skip this step if your orchid's pot does not have drainage holes. Water it in the sink until the water reaches just above the tree fern fiber. Then, put your hand on the fiber and gently dump out the excess water. Let it drain completely. You'll know when to water again when the fiber turns lighter in color. Tree fern fiber retains water quite well and still provide good aeration. However, when it starts to decompose, which can take a while, it'll start losing those capabilities.
if your orchid is growing in a rocky substance such as coal, gravel, rocks, leca, which are clay pebbles, etc.,
put your orchid and its pot into a second pot with no drainage holes. You can skip this part if your orchid's pot doesn't have drainage holes. Water them in the sink until the water reaches just right above the rocky substance. Wait for 10 to 15 minutes. After they're done soaking, put your hand on the rocks and gently allow it to drain completely. These rocky substances drain fast, so you'll likely have to water them more than any other growing medium.
If your orchid is mounted on something like a tree or rock, I recommend watering it more often since the orchid roots that are mounted onto something are more exposed than the ones that are in bark or sphagnum moss. I'll just water it regularly with a watering can or hose, and make sure to put a tray underneath it if you're indoors so the water doesn't go everywhere all over your floor. If your orchid is a terrestrial orchid, meaning that they grow in the dirt, then I recommend watering it like you would any other houseplant. But I will say, if your orchid has a shallow root system, then I would recommend watering it more often, but if your orchid has pseudobulbs, then I recommend watering it less often since the pseudobulbs store water. If your orchid is in a combination of these mediums, I recommend combining methods as well for the mediums that are in your mix. For example, if my orchid was growing in a mix of sphagnum moss and bark, I would soak them up like in the bark method, but I would also water less since sphagnum moss holds moisture. Let me know in the comments if you can't figure out which method to use for your orchid mix. I may be able to help you. Now, if your orchid is already overwatered, I recommend pruning any of the dead and mushy roots from your orchid, repotting it with a new growing medium. But I will say, I'm hopefully might be able to put out a video at one point detailing on, how to help your overwatered orchid. As you can see with my Cattleya orchid, it has no roots, so they can survive for some time, but they will be in critical condition. Another thing to consider is your orchid's particular watering needs. There are 9 to 11 species of orchids out there. You may end up with a drought-tolerant Cattleya like mine, or you could end up with a more water-tolerant Phalaenopsis, which is an orchid I want along with every single other species of orchid. The sun requirements may differ, affecting the evaporation rates of your orchid's growing medium. It really does differ. I really do hope that these watering methods help your orchid survive for years to come.
I hope you enjoyed this video. Please subscribe and hit that notification bell so you'll know when I upload new content. And